All right, MVJ, welcome to our webinar on extremism. I've been super excited about to do this. My name is Drew Lawrence. I'm the operations manager for MVJ. This has been a webinar that's been a long time coming, one that we've planned for a while, and we are very lucky to have two of the foremost experts on the subject, specifically extremism in the military, with us today, Andrew Mines and Dr. Daniel Milton. Andrew is from George Washington University's program on extremism, and Dr. Milton is from West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. And just as a preface, both of them have done incredible work in parsing through really extremism from all sorts: domestic extremism, international extremism. I actually reached out to Andrew last year because both of them co-authored this great report on the military experience at the Capitol, what happened on January 6th. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about other forms of domestic extremism, international extremism. But really, we're going to, what we want to get out of this is us as journalists and us as veterans who are journalists, the best practices on covering this, looking at it objectively as much as possible, cutting through the noise of misinformation and disinformation, and then hearing, of course, from these two experts that were nice enough to dedicate an hour of their busy time to help us do that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who's going to share a couple slides for us to get us started about what extremism is and some of the models that he uses to determine that as really a public health issue. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you. Are you able to share your screen?
I am, and thanks, Drew, and thanks for setting this up. It's a real privilege to be with you all this evening, and thanks for being on so late. I have really only like 2 slides that I want to share with you all. Can you see those okay?
Yep, we got them.
Excellent. Let me just go into, so this is full screen for everybody. But even before we get into the sides of, international, domestic, right, left, whatever we're talking about, I think it's useful to start with some common definitions, and then, like Drew said, just some common approaches to preventing extremism. And so really the most useful definition that I found as I've been working on this the last few years is one that was put forward by Jan Berger, and his book is literally called Extremism. It's available online, and I highly recommend it to everybody if you want to go ahead and buy it and read more after this. But he defines extremism as the belief that the survival of the in-group depends on hostile action against the out-group. It sounds really simple when you put it like that. It sounds very broad too. But if you break that up into 2 component parts, right? The first half, the belief that the survival of the in-group, that is something about the belief system, the cognition side, right? So we're talking entirely about what people believe, and there are a few things that kind of feed into that. Why do people believe that the survival of whatever in-group they identify with, why are they in crisis? Why is the survival of that in-group threatened? And so there are a bunch of actors that go into that. There are a bunch of narratives that go into that. And so one of the most common things is some sort of common crisis narrative. And that can be a number of different things. It means different things to different movements, to different ideologies, to different small cells and small groups. But there's always kind of a core crisis narrative there. Could be something about impurity, racial impurity, for example. Could be something that's driven by conspiracy theories, conspiracy beliefs about government overreach, or any number of things. Dystopia, apocalyptic narratives for a group like the Islamic State, and a bunch of other things that feed into this belief that an in-group is threatened. There are different types of mis and disinformation that feed into those belief systems that make people believe that they are threatened, that their in-group is threatened. There are state actors and non-state actors that are actively contributing to foreign malign influence operations that play on those narratives and seek to amplify them in online spaces. And so there's this really convoluted and complex array of actors and narratives that feed into the belief side of the equation. And then there's the behavioral side of the equation, which is hostile action against an outgroup. And that can mean a number of things too, but we're talking about the behavioral side here. And so that's a wide range of activity. And that could be everything from doxing people online in your designated outgroup, whoever it is, to on the very extreme end of the spectrum, genocide. And so it really covers a wide range of activity But I think when you think about it like that, it really opens up the range of things that we consider to be extremist beliefs and responses to those belief systems. And so I think this encompasses a really wide range of activity, and it gives you a better sense of both the behavioral side and then the the actual belief systems that go into making someone an extremist. It's pretty wide ranging, but it gives you kind of a core base to build off of. And then when we talk about prevention, just a lot of terms that you folks have probably come across, and that especially working in this space, you come across quite a lot. This is a little bit of a one-on-one, so I apologize if this is like boring or old for some people. But what we mean by prevention really falls into these three separate categories. If we talk about a public health approach, right? If we talk about a whole of society approach, is another thing that you've probably also heard pretty commonly cited by researchers in the news and elsewhere, which is breaking it down into different component parts of a public health approach. And starting with tertiary on the far end, right? That's something has happened. How do we respond to lessen its impact or prevent it from happening again? And by that, we could look at, let's say, somebody who traveled from this country to join the Islamic State overseas. We have to work on bringing them back to this country. How do we bring them back to this country to prosecute them here, to rehabilitate them? What does that look like? But they've already done something wrong, and we need to work on it. Secondary prevention. Something's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We know someone who's going to do it. How do we intervene to slow that down, to stop it ideally, or to reduce its impact if the actual thing is inevitable? And by that, we could look at what the FBI does to work interventions against folks who are about to commit and mobilize to violence. And then there's the primary prevention side. And this is where the field has been moving. Our field has been moving for some time now, but this really wasn't on the table, even maybe like 5-6 years ago. But this is where you're probably starting to see a lot more efforts from government conversation, especially on the Hill, where we're moving towards, which is something really hasn't happened yet, but how do we build broader resilience to keep it from actually happening? And so a good example is, media literacy, online training, teaching folks how to, they are going to engage with mis and disinformation online. How can they build resilience against it? How can they work to identify it, to see how it's playing on common crisis narratives and all those kind of things? So we talk about a whole society approach. We're really talking about the range of actors across those 3 points of prevention that come into play to work on that. And that's everything from the education side, working in our schools, all the way down to on the far end, the Bureau of working on the far end in terms of like counseling and reintegration and rehabilitation. So there's a huge range of actors that are involved, cuts across federal, state, local government. And it really is a broad range of actors that when we talk about a whole of society approach, whole of governance, whole of society response, that's what's required. And so I think that's the direction that a lot of the conversation has been moving in, that a lot of the policy has been moving in, and inevitably a lot of the things you guys are writing on and bringing to bear to the public. And so I just wanted to start and give us that kind of common base to work with. And I'll hand it back to Drew, but maybe Dan, if you have any thoughts too, I want to open it up to you as well.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. Actually, could you do you mind, while you're still, holding the power of co-hosting here, if you could throw back up your previous slide?
Yeah.
Because one thing that I think is potentially interesting to think about for this audience is, as you think about, in particular, the role of the military or of military experience in fostering somebody's extremist kind of journey, I think it's an area where we haven't really done a lot of great theorizing to understand it. There's not a lot of great research, and that's part of what I think Andrew and I are interested in continuing to work on. But thinking about this particular slide, I think really brings that home. And so, just think about, the extremist as needing to both adopt this mindset of, right, we need to survive as an in-group against something that an out-group is doing, And then the second part being, okay, now that we've adopted that mindset, how do we actually carry out an action in defense or in furtherance of that mindset? And I think it's very easy for a lot of folks to see on that second part how military kind of experience or military veterans might have a little bit of a leg up, right? Because when it comes to carrying out hostile action, potentially there is a little bit more familiarity with tactics and procedures and weapons and different types of things. Where I think we're still struggling is that first part of the equation is there something about being a part of a military kind of venture that leads you to adopt this mindset? And some of the work that I've done actually goes back and kind of does a very brief look and says, hey, like at earlier points in the military's history, there were specific kind of institutional features that might foster an in-group, out-group mindset. Think about, right, policies of discrimination against certain populations, right? Is saying, okay, like that's legitimate for there to be an in-group, out-group when the institution itself is telling you, yes, there are two different kind of, segments of society. A lot of those policies have been rolled back. And so I think what we've actually started to see more recently in a lot of the cases that are emerging is not so much that there's an institutional feature of the military that is kind of potentially encouraging some of this in-group, out-group dynamic, but instead what you see is just kind of the general things that you would see in other society. When people are kind of exposed to new experiences, at times that creates an opening for them to kind of begin thinking about the world in this in-group, out-group fashion. And there are some military experiences that I think uniquely do that. Think about deploying to a foreign country as being one of those where, hey, like I've never actually engaged with somebody from a Muslim population before. And now here I am, not just engaging with them, but in sometimes, right, an adversarial fashion. Does it have the possibility of kind of furthering that? Of course, the answer is there's a ton of people who go through that experience, even within the military, and most of them are not extremists, right? And so there's still a lot of individual nuance that we're just not very clear on. And so I just offer that because I think Andrew's framing here is really helpful for getting us to move away from just saying, military extremism, there's a relationship, but we don't really know a lot about it, to saying, okay, how might that actually look? And particularly from a journalistic standpoint, this is one of the things where, to be quite candid, I think you all often have a leg up when you're kind of writing and investigating these types of stories, is being able to pry is not the right word, but pry open or peel back the onion on people's journeys, right? Oftentimes, the sad state of things is that as researchers, we're reliant on kind of secondhand accounts. And I think sometimes those secondhand accounts, through nobody's fault, are relatively surface level. And I think that there's opportunities as we continue to look at these different cases that are emerging to say, okay, like, do we see that military experience really played a role in that in-group, out-group dynamic? Or is it really strictly just the in-group, out-group thing happens kind of organically independent of the military, but that hostile action piece is really important. So I'm sorry to talk a lot there, but those are some thoughts that are just kind of on my mind as I was going through that. So thanks, Andrew, for putting that back up.
No, that was an incredibly helpful introduction and provided a great framing and basis for some of these questions. And I'd like to remind, as we go on, we'll have time for questions for the group in the last 15 minutes. But for now, just a couple questions to Andrew and Dr. Milton. So you talked a little bit about trends in the way that some of these things are looking. And when we talk about extremist trends, it's extremism in general is emotional. It can be muddled by everything from environment to politics, and it becomes very unclear. So, recognizing that non-clarity up front is helpful, but for us as journalists, as we're looking at trending, extremism, whether it's domestic or international, what are some of the things that you're seeing that could be helpful for us to parse through a lot of that noise? What are some of the trends that we should be looking for, and some of the pitfalls that we should be aware of in our reporting?
Sure, I'm happy to get started, just because I think one of the best places to look for that kind of information is from intelligence community DHS assessments themselves. These are things that are put out very carefully. They are put out quarterly or yearly, depends on what you're looking at, but those give you a really good sense of how the government sees those trends developing and what their response should be. And I think those give you a really good pulse on trends as they move from month to month, but also certainly over the years. And so best two that I can think of are the ODNI Worldwide Assessment that comes out yearly. That's a great place to think about, not just domestic issues that we're working on, but internationally as we look across the globe. You ask us this question 5 years ago, and the biggest concern is hunger and violent extremism. Who's going to be traveling overseas to join the Islamic State? Who is going to be conducting an attack at a nightclub, at a place of worship, somewhere else on our streets here in the US on behalf of the Islamic State or maybe another group? The question today, the answer is much different. It's lone actors, small cells, predominantly in the militia movement, in the white supremacist movement. And those are the same trends that have been echoed in assessments made by ODNI, made also by DHS. And so that was going to be the second one that I would point to. The DHS NTAS, the bulletin that they put out quarterly, is another great resource because that gives you a little bit more of a up on the beat, quarter by quarter idea of what is going on and how the government sees those threats evolving. So,
yeah, in the realm of kind of government information, let me also just throw out there, and again, probably something that you all are well aware of, but whenever, the FBI director is appearing on the Hill, or when you have an important figure who's going to testify before a committee, usually the information that comes out of those is quite insightful. Sometimes you even see a little bit of space between the formal assessment, which has to go through a pretty deep coordination process within the US government or within the intelligence community, and what the FBI director or the director of national intelligence will say in a session of Congress, right? And some of those are obviously closed session, but the US government has been trying to do a better job about being somewhat transparent about how it's thinking about these things. So those kind of assessments are helpful. If I could just throw one other thing out there in terms of cutting through the noise. I think everyone is familiar with kind of the concept of, and the value of triangulation, right? And so obviously I think the government and its updates are a good one. I think you also need to find and identify a source of information from kind of the research academic realm, the non-government realm, because often what you find is that those individuals are willing to say things that the government is not prepared to say or can't get the kind of authority to say. And so I think about, since this is a group of friends, I think about the kind of recent willingness of the government to kind of attach in my view, the correct threat value to domestic extremism, and particularly that of the violent far right. There were academics who I think were saying some of these things in advance of kind of the government and kind of, years before that. But I think that it just took a little bit of time for them to get traction. And so I kind of think about it as, okay, I definitely want to kind of focus on those things that Andrew pointed out. And then I would also want to have kind of a small cadre of academics, and for better or worse, they're easier to find on Twitter these days, that I'm kind of following in kind of the research and work that they're doing, because I think often they will sometimes be in advance of the government, and they also are not. Look, everyone's got an agenda, but they're not generally trying to advance the same types of political points. And so I think sometimes you'll find a willingness to say things that you won't find in kind of government spaces. And to that end, if you're not following the program on extremism, if you're not following the work that's coming out of the acronym evades me, Andrew might know, NSIGHT at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, like these are places that are going to be on the front end, I think, of academic work in this space. And so those are some kind of research centers, and obviously there's individual kind of staff and faculty attached to those that are worth following, but those are a couple of key nodes that I think are worth paying attention to.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because, as we established in the beginning with the definitions that Andrew had brought up, when you talk about extremist groups, you talk about there's this concept of a perceived otherness or like a fear of like apocalyptic. And then, the other side of it, the oppressors to this, the quote unquote oppressors to the extremist group, How, especially when we're talking about domestic extremism, how would you recommend that we as journalists reconcile with the fact that our information is coming from the government, which is seen as the oppressor to some of these groups? How do you reconcile that a lot of these groups, dislike the elites, which could, that could be perceived in the academic circles, and same with being a journalist, like the media is under attack from some of these groups that perceive the media to be an arm of whatever the oppressor is. What would your best recommendation be to kind of combat that and reconcile those factors?
Sure. I think, Dan said this earlier, but triangulation is a great one. And as he said, not relying solely on those government disseminated products, and also going to research and academic outlets as well. I think that's a great way to, in a single piece or over a series of pieces, really kind of flesh that out. Because if you do rely too much on one thing, look, I think there's also a simple fact of this, that there's just a certain population of your guys' readership that you don't have the ability to, in one piece, convince them that the government is not out to get them or something like that. You just don't have that ability. A lot of folks that are going to read that and be thinking or be in the mindset that you're describing, especially if we're moving more towards an extremist mindset. Maybe one piece isn't going to accomplish that. There's also a lot of great studies out there that actually show that folks who hold these beliefs, some of them, especially, if we look at stuff related to the January 2020 election or the 2020 election, a lot of them, in their own words, go out and try and do their own research. Folks who still hold that belief system, right? And it's not just on singular sources of information. There's a good study, I think, by the Atlantic Council that looks into this. And that shows that folks are actually pretty actively trying to seek out their own research. And so I think as much as you can, having a very basic base of concepts that you talk about. So when we talk about definitions, having those definitions very simple and accessible to people, having a broad range of sources that you go to across the research and academic spectrum, but also within government as well, I think is a great way to do that. But also recognizing, just coming back to it, recognizing the limits of what you can do with one piece and whose minds you can change with one piece, because it does take a whole of a society approach, which was the second slide that I showed there. So Daniel, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm certainly not the best person to, because this is, obviously you guys are the professionals in the journalism realm, but I do appreciate you that you recognize that, look, when it comes to extremists themselves, they're going to find a way to make any sort of government or academic or kind of journalist story that is unfavorable to their worldview the result of some conspiracy, shoddy reporting, like whatever. Like that's just what they do. Like, if you've spent any time in extremist kind of, Telegram or encrypted, like they have more discretionary time than somehow the rest of us do put together, right? And this is how they spend it. But what I do think is critical to note is that, and look, this is the case with extremism. You've got the people who are probably like anti-extremists or working to kind of counteract them. You've got the kind of hardcore extremists, but then in the middle, you have this very important population that can lend support, sympathy, whatever you want to call it, in either direction. And I think that those folks tend to genuinely be interested in doing the right thing, whatever that is. And I think that this is where the media plays such a critical role in producing information that is really valuable for people who are trying to kind of understand what the facts are. But one of the things that's been interesting to me, to be honest, as I've talked with my friends and kind of family about it is, they'll often come to me and they'll be like, what's going on here? What's the ground level truth? And they're getting their information from what I would characterize as some guy on Twitter who's just bored and tweeting stuff out, or probably Facebook, right? They're all older generation folks, let's be honest, right? And so this is where they're getting their information from. And I'm like, look, you guys, you realize that there's a difference between the journalism of a guy on Twitter and an individual who's part of a reputable journalistic venture. And to be honest, they aren't aware of that, right? They think that a journalist is someone who picks up a pen and starts writing. They don't realize that there are standards of ethics and norms and professional development and all of this kind of stuff. Now, this is the part where I'm just not sure what the connection, like how the connection is to an actual tangible thing that could be done. But I wish that people who were reading a story understood what went behind it, right? Understood the checking of sources, understood all of those things. Is it as simple as, you know, at the end of every story, there's a link, hey, want to learn more about how this story was put together? Now, obviously, every story can't have a background, but even like an understanding of the different things that go into a piece, I think add credibility to it, right? So that they realize that, you know, Drew didn't just go out and talk to the random person on the street and say, that sounds good to me. Like that's what I'm going to go with, right? But honestly, that's how a lot of folks who are, I think, are in this kind of middle space think about what journalists do. And, you know, as I've had the opportunity to get to know a lot of people in your field, it's just crazy, right? I mean, that's not how it works. And so I think that helping people understand not just, you know, the punchline about a particular story, but as best they can, the actual practices that go into it, I think is really interesting. Sorry, Andrew, I think I cut you off.
No, that was great. I just something else came to mind that I was talking about with a colleague just yesterday, and that's, you know, when it's hard for you guys. I can't appreciate enough like the tough job that you guys have to do on a daily basis. Like, you're entering a space where there's like very limited options to be neutral, or to just be entirely fact-based. You're entering an environment where you're having to combat influence operations from other actors, or it could just simply be misdis and other types of malinformation. But I think a colleague put together a model of what do malign influence actors themselves do to erode everything and to kind of exacerbate extremist tensions and polarization in this country. And I think it's a good model to keep in mind every time you're writing a piece, to think about these three things and to be doing the exact opposite. What do those actors do to try and erode our society? Basically, they try to erode trust in authority and expertise. That could be medical professionals, that could be government officials, it could be a number of different authority figures, but trying to erode trust in their character, in the very positions they hold, and et cetera. The second one is trust in democracy and democratic processes themselves. Again, 2020 election is a great example, but trying to erode trust in the very things that make this country. And then the final one is social trust between people. And so I think if you think about those three things every time you approach a piece, and think about what are the different types of narratives that I'm engaging with around all of those three things, and how can this piece promote the opposite, if at all, I think is a great way to kind of internalize that and then approach a piece.
So I'm glad you guys brought up credibility and trust, because, you know, that's kind of the reason why we wanted to have this specific webinar, is because, you know, for better or for worse, or for deserve it or not, veterans, and, you know, bring a certain credibility into the space that they you know, enter into, whether it's politics or whatnot. And that's why we have veteran journalists that are here listening to this, because you know, there's a way to use that credibility to, you know, the story's benefit, you know, obviously keeping it true, but all, you know, kind of cutting through that that otherness that we had talked about. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think is kind of the best way to leverage that in an appropriate way without, you know, coming off as bias or you know, terse or touting service, but emphasizing that, like, hey, there's an broad range of experience that veterans bring to reporting, whether it be, you know, like you said, like combating extremism face to face on an deployment, or doing it at home while at uniform and dealing with it in the own ranks. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I will offer just a couple of thoughts, but with the very important caveat that you all probably know better than I do, you know, how to think about these things. But as you were talking, Drew, like, it's so interesting, right? and I don't mean this to offer any sort of real equivalency, but the same reason that veterans are valued in extremist movements is the reason that we ought to value them in your profession, right? Which is very different than their profession, to be clear. But I think that there is an amount of credibility, there is an amount of trust that is placed by individuals who have served in the armed forces, rightly so. And the trick, of course, is that, you know, you're obviously not overtly a military person. Like if someone picks up a story and reads a kind of thing, it's not immediately apparent that that's the kind of credibility that you bring to it. I mean, you know, simple things, which I assume are the case, but to be honest, I don't actually know. You know, when someone clicks on your name and it says, you know, Daniel Milton is a journalist for X, you know, and does it say that I also served, right? Hope that for a lot of folks, and maybe that's not something that it could be, but by way of kind of both providing, excuse me, by way of both providing truth in advertising, but also benefiting from that credibility push. Hopefully that's something that is part of everybody's profile, right? Because it helps a reader understand, yes, the potential bias, but also the potential benefit that someone brings to the table as they're looking at a story. You know, obviously one can't, you know, say at the beginning of a story, P.S. I'm a veteran, so you should give me more credibility. And so it's going to be those subtle cues that I think are kind of important. You know, making those references. It's not humble bragging. It's an important part of the kind of the thoughtfulness that you bring to your work. You know, and I think that those kind of what I would refer to as subtle cues, whether it's a line in a bio or a quick mention in an interview or whatever the case might be, that I think are probably the ways where you can still adhere to your own norms of professional ethics and performance while also signaling the value that you bring to the table because of the experiences that you've had. Andrew, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts, but those are just some quick ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I just to build off of Daniel, maybe on the extreme end of what not to do is don't make a heroic narrative out of yourself. And I feel like that seems like a pretty obvious thing to state, but I've seen a lot of folks, you know, enter your guys' space and then podcast form, article series form, whatever. It becomes about them, the story. I've seen this in like different terrorism reporting, different obviously extremism reporting as well, but like really centering themselves, and then you just become lost in this cult of personality about the reporter or whoever is building the story, and not about the subject matter, not about the so what, why is this important, why are we working with this, but it's just like a, you know, like basically like a movie story. So trying to avoid that as best as possible. And to that end, yeah, and this speaks also to what Daniel was saying, but like specifically focusing on cults of personality that involve folks who have military experience. We're talking about Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers. You know, Drew's written a piece about this. You guys are the best ones. You're the ones best positioned to engage that and say, hey, look, this is discrediting the military as an institution. Him taking his experience and trying to exploit that and exploit others is wrong. And as Daniel said, you guys are in the best position to use your own experience to say, hey, look, I know because I've been there and I've done that. So I think really focusing on cults of personality, not worst case scenario, not doing that, which I hope nobody on this call would think about doing that, but certainly calling it out in extremist movements, and in smaller cells and all the way up and down the chain. So
I wanted to I appreciate you mentioning that, Andrew, because it's a good transition into something we've talked about before, about some of the tropes that I'm going to say media as a whole that happen. So whether it's on Twitter or something like that, but there are a lot of tropes that are associated with this extremist reporting. An example that we've talked about before is, you know, in terms of militia extremism, just because someone has a military background doesn't necessarily means that they are that much deadlier or have more expertise in handling weapons or things like that. The militia, like we see, you know, constant media reports about he was, you know, quote unquote marked as a sharpshooter, when in reality that's, you know, one of the middlemost qualifications for rifle qualifications, but you know, it tends to get run away with. What are some of the tropes that you've seen that we should be aware of in our reporting, and that you've studied in your research that we can kind of objectively pick through and say, hey, this is something that's wrong, but is often repeated. And this is kind of more where the truth lies.
I mean, that's exactly it. Daniel and I wrote about this in our report back in April 2021, but we're talking about the tactical ad or the perceived tactical ad. A lot of times it's not even there in some of these cases, versus the strategic ad of folks with military experience to extremist movements, groups, ideologies. The strategic ad is that they add legitimacy. And that's probably one of the most important things. Putting up a stack formation or whatever, like, is very basic things. Like, I could probably do that, going upstairs. That's not something about military experience that we really need to dive into and analyze the hell out of. That's the tactical stuff. But the bigger, missing the forest for the trees thing is the legitimacy that folks with military experience who join extremist movements or groups, the legitimacy that they bring, the normalization that they bring to those ideologies and those movements. And so that's the bigger picture thing. I think that often goes lost.
I think one of the things that's also interesting in some of the work that I've been doing, and certainly that Andrew and I have been working on as well, is that it's just again, I mentioned how a lot of folks that I speak with have a very poor understanding of what you as journalists do from kind of a professional standpoint. It's also quite shocking how many people have a very poor understanding of the military itself, right? And so it's easy for them to fall into a lot of these pitfalls about, well, if a person has military experience, they will clearly be more dangerous. Now, to be perfectly fair, there is also some research which shows that I think that is generally true, and that there definitely are those who are more, I think, prepared and capable because of even basic military training, to say nothing of more advanced training. But in general, I don't know that it's orders of magnitude different, that it deserves the kind of status that we give to it. But think about the stories that are being written. So-and-so is, a combat veteran. Well, what does that even mean? Like, as you all know, you can be in a combat zone and have very little combat experience, right? Simply because of the nature of your kind of function. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that makes one's service any less, but when it comes to reporting on their ability to carry out violent action, there's a big difference there, right? I mean, their kind of ability to kind of roll with some of those punches. I think we also have to be careful, and Andrew and I really struggled with how to deal with this. There's potentially mental health tropes and kind of things that are easy to fall into. And again, that's not just something that kind of beguiles or bedevils the kind of extremism angle, but I do think that there is a tendency, and frankly, we've actually seen this play out not just in reporting, but also in court cases where there's a kind of willingness to kind of lay one's military service on the line as a statement in their defense or in their kind of justification. And I think we have to be careful about unintentionally furthering those kind of things by prioritizing, when it comes to someone's military experience, their injury, combat deployment, medals, like all of that is important context, but if that's the only thing that gets highlighted in a story, then that's the takeaway for somebody, that like, hey, a highly decorated combat veteran, and you're like, well, several of those were ribbons that you got for just being in the zone. Like, you guys know the kind of difference and distinction, but the public has no clue, right? They just don't get that kind of stuff. And so I do think that there is a need to kind of have a little bit of kind of nuance in how, even as it kind of relates to military experience, that is reported. And again, it's tough because you have limited space and you can't give a whole explanation and so on and so forth. But I think those are some things that initially kind of stand out to me. Andrew?
I was just gonna say, and you have limited time. I mean, like, Daniel and I can sit on a report for, however long we took to write the thing last year, but you guys have 24 hours to get on it before it doesn't matter for the most part.
Or as you're seeing here, Drew, we can respond very lengthy to simple questions. So obviously.
No, it's okay. It's all good stuff. Well, I have one or two more questions on my end. I want to open it up to both of you to kind of talk about anything that we didn't cover, and then I'll open it up to the group for questions. I want to talk a little bit about international extremism because as we pivot away from Afghanistan and a lot of the public media transitions away from that sphere. Um, Obviously, the story doesn't stop just because people stop paying attention to it, or just because the U.S. isn't in a certain place. What are some things that I know both of you have studied international extremism. Andrew, I know you've done a lot with ISIS. What are some things that you would like to see reported on in terms of international extremism that has kind of gone by the wayside but hasn't stopped?
I think the best you can help disseminate to the, or like really help the public understand the difference between when ODNI puts out an assessment that says we think that between 6 to 12 months from now there is a likelihood that there will be a foreign directed attack, or there will be an attack with links to ISIS in country X or something like that. Helping disseminate that down to what that might actually look like and what are the different avenues that would look like, because that means very different things. At the height of ISIS's days, they had an external operations wing focused in major cities in Iraq and Syria, primary English language speakers that were thinking day and night about how to network people in the US, in the UK, in other Western countries to conduct attacks on their home countries. They were talking with them, they were pushing out propaganda, they were coordinating and planning those attacks from the caliphate. To my knowledge, there's not an ISIS entity across the globe right now that I think has quite that capacity. I just don't think that's the case right now. I haven't seen anything that suggests that. But that's different from homegrown violent extremism, as we understand an inspired attack. Doesn't necessarily need to have been in contact with an ISIS affiliate or the Islamic State core itself. But distinguishing between those two things and which is more likely, which is how those threat avenues are different, and helping disseminate that to people, because a lot of times people see those kinds of assessments and they're like, oh, great, like there's going to be a terrorist attack coming out of Afghanistan in 6 months from now, and that's really all they do to engage with that piece of news. And so I think helping to sparse that out for folks and really distinguish between those different avenues and those different channels and what it means for ISIS at its heyday in 2014-15 versus where we are today.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I think that the kind of consistent struggle from a U.S. national security policy perspective that we've kind of gone through is what I refer to, and it is certainly not original to me, as the kind of, 6-year-old soccer ball kind of analogy, right? If you've ever been to a soccer game with your 6-year-old, the coach spends too much time getting them all like properly positioned. And then once the ball starts going, then it's just like a big herd chasing stuff around. And I think that there's obviously an appropriate balance to strike, but I do fear that we are missing some of that kind of international threat boat in our very important pursuit of what's going on domestically. I do think that there are still some of those international threads, and I'll just kind of talk about one thing where I do think there's probably a kind of a fruitful venture there is, the kind of underlying root causes that drive extremism, particularly in the international space, as it relates to groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, they haven't gone away, right? And in many cases, they've just gotten worse. Northeastern Syria, in terms of kind of a humanitarian crisis, is getting worse, not better. And there is a tipping point. I don't know where it is. If I did, I'd probably be able to be more useful. But those things are going to be a large issue in the not too distant future. And I think that we're just kind of missing that boat, in part because they're just really sticky problems, and in part because we'd like to ignore them as a policy kind of, we just don't really want to deal with that. And I think that there is need to kind of keep a focus on those things, because they will drive both the actual ability of groups to reorganize and recruit, and as those groups are able to keep themselves in the limelight, the kind of inspiration that they offer to individuals abroad to carry out activities and violence, like Andrew has noted. And I think that we're we're missing those things, unfortunately. You know, and there's a variety of them that we could kind of talk about, whether we're going to stay in kind of the Middle East, whether we want to go over to kind of the Pacific region, talk about some of those, or Africa. I mean, there's all sorts of what the 9/11 Commission you know, would have referred to as blinking red type stuff going on from a threats perspective that I think we're not necessarily kind of tracking. And then the second thing, which frankly I haven't seen anybody do a lot of digging into, but I think it's a really interesting signal of kind of the continued threat posed by international extremism, is there have been a, you know, a huge number of prosecutions of terrorists happening in countries around the world related to what's happened in Iraq and Syria in particular. And I think that those prosecutions, if they were scrutinized a little bit more, would reveal a lot more concerning of a threat picture than we are currently getting. And so, you know, most folks are aware of, you know, something that happens in the US space, an arrest or an indictment. You know, we obviously had recently Allison Fluke, you know, kind of, that was an interesting one, and obviously presented again just a real insight into how we think about women in extremism. And Andrew's colleague Dev Margolin has done a really interesting kind of, you know, stuff on this. There was a case in April of an individual up in Maine who was arrested for possessing 3 IED type devices, and was potentially going to carry out an extremist plot. And so we generally hear about those, but people are unfamiliar that these things are continuing at clip in Germany, Sweden, France, There's so many individuals who continue to be arrested for offenses related to this stuff. And I think there's just not as much of a vantage point on it as perhaps there ought to be.
I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions now. If you have a question, please go ahead and ask it. And then before you ask another question, just wait. Just do one question at a time. I know we could talk about this all night, but we want to give everyone a chance to pick these guys' brains, because obviously, as we've talked, we've learned that they're the experts in these fields. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute and ask it. But again, just one at a time, please.
Hey, everybody, and thank you, Daniel and Andrew, for being here. This has been really informative. I want to backtrack a little bit and go back to domestic terrorism and the inherent bias that exists in reporting when it comes to domestic terrorism. We know that in the last several years, mass shootings have been overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly male. And it's not labeled as extremism when there's not a clearly identifiable race or a clearly identifiable faith, because we know that it's quickly labeled as extremism when it's a Muslim, when it's someone who is a darker skin, who is someone other than white, it's literally other than white. How can we be more responsible when race is not identifiable, when it's other than white, and when it's a religion that's other than Christianity? It erodes trust in one community and promotes it in another. How can we be more responsible in reporting when we don't tell the truth about the fact that domestic extremism is overwhelmingly white, male, and young?
I think one of the biggest kind of tensions that comes out of this, and thank you for bringing that question up. I think it's a really important one. It's something we've been working on here at POE for some time, which is like the lack of a domestic terrorism statute. You know, the FBI local chapters can come out and call things domestic terrorism, but they can't prosecute it for being that, because there's no criminal law that exists unless they were using a weapon of mass destruction or like a biological agent or one of the 8 or so things that make it terrorism prosecutable in nature, right? But we have a foreign terrorist organizations list, and that means that, to your point, all the other kind of ideological violence, terrorism, gets labeled, prosecuted that way. And so I think having a good sense of the legal structure in this country at a federal level, at least for how we define these things, how we are able to prosecute these things, and where there are gaps. Are those gaps worth being filled? And then giving that to people in a really digestible way. And we have a bunch of products on this that I'm happy to share that really try to boil this down for folks. Because you're right, it is a huge gap in how we address this problem. It's also a reason why only just recently we're starting to see real government products speaking about it in this way. And so I think it's a great question, and I'm happy to, we've done a lot of things here at the program that can help contribute to a better public understanding of that discrepancy. So.
Yeah, there's and this is, Andrew's got some great stuff. Aaron Kearns, who now works at the University of Nebraska Omaha as part of Insight, actually has done some really great research on this very phenomenon. If you are not familiar with her work, I think it's worth kind of recognizing. And I would just say that I think that this is where, in part because of the legal kind of challenges that Andrew has raised, but also if I'm being perfectly candid, and obviously speaking as myself and not an employee of the federal government, I think that there is unfortunately just an underlying bias that is beyond legal, right? And I think that we need to be frank in recognizing and kind of accepting that. Now, in terms of a solution, this is part of where I would go back to the value of triangulation of sources. The federal government is not going to be a leader in dealing with this problem. I wish that they would be, I really do, but my personal opinion is they're not going to be. And so I think it falls to other communities who are doing important work in these spaces to help kind of provide a more accurate picture of what is happening, and about the fact that even if there isn't a domestic terrorism statute, which I think there's a very kind of legitimate debate to be had about that, we can still look at an individual's kind of activities and say, hey, like this fits the same mold that if it were a Muslim, we'd be talking about, we'd be talking about terrorism. And here we're like, well, we can't get ahead of ourselves and we got to talk, whatever, right? And unfortunately, if you rely mostly on statements from federal kind of, that's what you're going to get, right? And again, part of that is legal, part of that I think is bias. And so I think that just really emphasizes the need to draw on some of these other resources in your reporting, because I think you'll find that they have a little bit more intellectual latitude to be able to engage with these subjects in ways that the government is just not going to be as effective on. And again, that's just my personal take, but I think that it is lamentable. But I also think, sorry, Drew, there couldn't be a short answer, right? It's just not happening, and I'm sorry about that.
It was a great question that deserves a long answer.
It is a great question. I mean, it's an excellent question, but I also do think we have. Sorry, did I cut you off there? I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying thank you for even being willing to explore that, because that's a question that's not often asked or answered. It's literally never answered. So I thank you for your willingness to even answer it. Thank you.
No, I do. I think that it is important. If you go to circle back to the very beginning, if you go back to what Andrew said about a definition of extremism, there are clearly things that happen that fall in that definition that we won't call extremism. And I think that, again, for the federal government and for many state and local agencies, that's a legal challenge. But I think that there are other parts of that we need to kind of deal with as well. But I think that you'll find it outside of the government, frankly. Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say very quickly, it's actually kind of a follow-up question for you, Daniel, but I've just seen a lot more folks in this space, Karen, to your question, starting to focus on hate crimes, getting funding from the federal government or from other places to focus on hate crimes in this space as part of a terrorism or extremism problem set. I just wanted to gauge your thoughts maybe on that, and from us as researchers, how that should fit into this picture as well. And then for you folks as reporters, reporting on that, showcasing that trend, encouraging that trend towards us thinking about these things is not completely separate.
And Dr. Milton, I'm going to hold you to a short answer on that one, just because we have a really good question in the chat that I'd like you to answer as well. But sorry, go ahead.
It's also a great kind of question. And I think that unfortunately, it's just going to be it's going to make the waters muddier, not clearer. And I think that just comes down back to, we really need to be very careful when we talk about things like hate crime, extremism, mass shootings, about what we are talking about. And I think that the clearer we are, the easier it will be to kind of see the areas where those things overlap. And in some cases they don't overlap, but I just think we need to be much clearer about that than we are, both as an academic community, as a federal government, and probably as journalists too, but that's not my lane. So I'll leave that to you guys.
Carol asked a really great question. Can we also talk more specifically about extremism in the military? How can we better understand that in terms of domestic extremism? And to add on to Carol's question, the DoD has gone, especially after January 6th, kind of gone on a rip about extremism in the military. Let's say there's success in rooting it out of the military. What's next? Where are those people who have been rooted out of the military for extremist activity going to go? But thank you for the question, Carol.
They're going to join the Patriot Front, right? I mean, this is,
I would just like to say that when I say in the military, I'm also understanding that in the broader sense, in the military and in the veteran community. And how much do we know about this really?
Andrew can obviously jump in and correct. Short answer, not as much as we need to. There's still a lot of data collection that needs to be done. We don't understand, as kind of per our earlier conversation, a lot about the different mechanisms that might actually intersect between extremism and the military. Andrew and I are doing some work there. I'm working on a book on the subject right now that one of these days I'll get done. But like, there's a lot of things that we need to be doing there that we don't. But clearly, I think we need to spend a lot of time, a lot more time engaging in that. And although I certainly applaud the DoD's efforts, as an individual who observed how that order kind of trickled out at the lower levels, I think there's still a lot to be desired. Obviously, signaling from the Pentagon is good, but the DoD is a very massive organization. And I think that the results were very uneven in terms of how people are thinking about it. So I do think there's still a lot of work to be done in that space.
I completely agree. I mean, if you look at the reporting that came out of the working groups, December 2021 report, I think, or something like that, it was a couple of the branches had no reported cases of extremism in the military, which I find quite hard to believe. And so data is really important. I think between 2013 and 2018, there were fewer cases than in 2021 overall. And a lot of that had to do with January 6th, but from a trends perspective, from a data perspective, that's kind of hard to believe that over half a decade or plus, there were fewer cases than in 1 year. That might also be the case though, but the problem is that we just don't have better data. And so I think holding institutions that are congressionally mandated and are responsible for giving us that data, holding them to account when those reports are slated to release, really kind of being tuned in and saying, all right, this doesn't look right. There's something about this that just, we're not seeing the full picture here. And so I think that's a really important thing to stay cued in on. Yeah.
I know that we're supposed to have a hard stop, but given Andrew's
I knew it was going to go on. So
I have to
it's okay. It's a good conversation.
One area where I think that as it relates to extremism in the military, where there is probably excellent reporting that still needs to be done, is on the relationship between DoD and FBI as it applies to prosecuting cases in the military. I can't offer a whole lot more about that, but I think that there's work to be done there that would reveal opportunities to improve and how we're actually handling that stuff. And so that would be one thing that I would just submit for consideration of the distinguished group here.
I'm going to two more questions. Gretchen grabbed the first one. She put it in the group, but she asked, political polarization makes it ever more complex for so many reasons. How do we work on that?
Andrew's smart. I'm going to let him answer.
Thanks, Dan. I think there's a research lab here in DC called the Polarization Extremism Peril at American. I'm going to botch the whole acronym. I'm sorry. Peril at American University. You should check out their work. This is exactly their wheelhouse. This is what they focus on. And specifically, you know, going back to that second slide on different phases of prevention, we're really looking at, you know, secondary, tertiary is probably too late. You know, at that point, it's really hard to change people's minds, and it takes a lot of resources to do that. On the primary prevention side, what can we do to combat polarization and to start like eating away at that? And I think some of the work that these folks are doing is great, and packaging 7-minute programs like videos for folks that have high efficacy that work in certain cases. You know, how do we package all these different things to reduce polarization, to in their, how they describe it, inoculate, but we can also call it build resilience against extremist beliefs, extremist information as it enters the information environment. And so they do great work. I think you should, I'm just going to plug them here. You should check them out.
Thank you. I will definitely check them out.
So obviously, if the question is coming about how do we as journalists, again, I feel just so unqualified to offer you kind of thoughts, but how do you as veterans, I think is a very different kind of answer, at least for me. We did some work many years ago on kind of how people could counter kind of Islamic State or ISIS kind of narratives. And one of the things that research revealed was that it's not that people don't oppose those narratives. It's not that people are in favor of political polarization. It's just often that those who are on the extremes or those who are in favor of polarization are better and louder and more well organized than everyone else. And so I think that there are lots of opportunities where there's you know, we the veterans, right? There's a lot of great causes who are trying to provide a united voice, not in favor of one political ideology or the other, but in favor of fairness, transparency, equality, like all of the values that I think undergird a functioning democratic system. And I think we just need more people speaking out in favor of those things, not about, you know, whether you've got a D or an R in front of your name, who cares about that? Like, but about the kind of value that we can all bring to each other. So
Surfacing, you know, one of the ways what Daniel is describing is surfacing, and that's something you guys have all the power to do. Surfacing folks who do this kind of work. We the Veterans is a great example. One of the ways that extremists work and the way that mis and disinformation work and the actors that promote it online works is that they insert all of these narratives, fog the information environment, and then program and flood it the way that they want it to go, so that the narrative that emerges is the one that kind of has been fogging around, but the truth has been obfuscated. And then they surface other things to kind of support that narrative as they're flooding the information environment. We just need folks doing that on the opposite end too. You know, we need to be surfacing the work of veterans who do just the opposite. And so I can't agree with Daniel more. Focusing on folks who do really positive work in this country, veterans, more so than most, is really important.
We have time for one last question.
Hey, gents, Constantine with military.com here. Wanted to ask, you know, one of the things that I know me and my colleagues have been reporting on a little bit more lately and have noticed is a shift from, you know, organizations that skew older, like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys, to younger skewing organizations like Patriot Front beginning to sort of creep into the news more frequently. You know, is your research sort of suggesting that we're, you know, or have you guys looked into the idea that what we're seeing here is kind of a passing of the torch, a changing the guard amongst some of these extremist organizations, shifting from like the previous generation to the newer one?
I don't know if we lost Daniel or not, but oh, okay. Do you want to take the first stab at that?
I mean, my stab will simply be to say, I don't know that I have looked enough at that specific issue about kind of generational change as it relates to these organizations, although I will note that it is something that all extremist / terrorist organizations seem to struggle with from time to time. So I don't know that I have enough kind of a baseline to say that's what we're seeing. What I do find interesting is that groups like Patriot Front do seem to be a little bit better when it comes to the kind of online activities, propaganda, meme space than some of these other organizations do. And I think that that does have a potential appeal to a younger generation. We actually saw a little bit of this even with groups like ISIS and others. And so I think the fact that there is generational kind of transformation may be true. I'm just not sure what the ultimate kind of cause of it is, whether these guys are just better at things that those individuals are familiar with, like some of these online spaces, or not. So I don't really have, unfortunately, a good answer for your good question.
I can just add the simple thing that my colleague John Lewis does a lot of the domestic terrorism tracking here, and he has found that neo-fascist skull mass groups at and off from the base, like really the hardcore neo-Nazi groups that folks with military experience tend to join or do join at the very least. There are folks with military experience in these groups are younger. The people that are way crazier, have crazier plots, that are doing probably some of the more awful things, they tend to skew younger. So I again, we're doing some of that tracking here at the program. I encourage you to check it out. So,
Gentlemen, do you have any parting words for the group?
This has been great. You guys, I think, have all my email and Daniel's emails. Drew.
Yeah, it's in the, so it was in the mass group that everyone got. If you look at the CC line, Andrew and Dr. Milton are on there. But if gentlemen, if you just want to drop it into the chat real quick so people can quickly copy it down before we head out, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue the conversation anytime. If there's strands of today that anybody wants to go on, my door is virtually in person. If you're in DC, it's always open. So thanks for letting me be a part of this, Drew.
No, thank you, Andrew.
Can I leave you with just two cliffhangers really quickly? So first one is, I think there is probably a conversation to be had about how we report and think about big data and online activity when we report on extremist activities. I think that we have a potential for being infatuated with stuff that doesn't accurately reflect what's going on. So, chew on that. And then the second one is go to prison. And I don't mean that literally for yourselves, but I do think that there is also a kind of future challenge that is going to emerge in the extremist space as it relates to kind of prisoners and radicalization and them getting out later that we haven't explored enough in the United States. So, just random thoughts that came, but that's all I got. And thank you so much for letting us come and be a part of the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Milton. I'm going to leave, as people trickle out, I'm going to leave it up, the links up just for another 30 seconds while people copy them down. But again, I just want to, on behalf of MVJ, I just want to sincerely thank both of you for taking the time to do this. It's an incredibly important space. I'm hoping that we can, maybe make this a series if you guys liked us and you'd love to come back. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm asking you to tell us that you liked us. But we sincerely appreciate it, and this is important for us, especially as veterans who are journalists, to cover responsibly. And I think that we have the space to do it, and you adding and contributing your objective research is incredibly important for us to do that. So thank you.
Hey, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Yep. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care, everyone.